That's incredibly kind. And gosh, thank you so much for endowing a series like this. I was saying briefly before, as we met, when my in-laws passed away, they were longtime members of First Presbyterian Church in Annapolis, Maryland. And in their will, they left a nice bequest to First Presbyterian Church. And one of the things that they had been interested in their entire lives were how books impact congregations, how great ideas can really change the life of a community. And my mother-in-law had been a librarian. My father-in-law was actually a submarine commander, but he learned to read after he built a nuclear submarine or two. So anyway, they were wonderful people, and it's just such an honor when I get invited to speak in one of these series, because in part my family's tradition is supporting and funding such series and congregations. So thank you very much. It is an honor to be with you all, and I'm glad you're doing this. Oh, I went into the girls' room, put on some makeup so I wouldn't look quite so transparent, since I happened to wake up really early this morning. That's why I'm drinking coffee too. I was not going to watch the royal wedding because your bishop kept me out last night late for dinner. And every time I turned around, he was refilling my glass of wine. And I kept saying, Jeff, stop, stop, stop. And I guess that's what bishops do. They like refilling glasses of wine. You know, it's just part of the job. So anyway, I went to bed a little later than I expected, and I woke up at 5:45, and I had set my alarm for 7:30 or something, and I said, oh darn it, now I'm just going to have to turn on the TV and see the dress, see what Meghan Markle's wearing. And so I turned on the television. I got completely transfixed, watched every minute of it, and then of course it was amazing because Michael Curry's sermon was incredibly remarkable. And those of you who are Episcopalians, which I'm assuming are a good number of you in the room, will really like this. A secular reporter from Esquire.com, who was there, wrote a story about the sermon. And the headline is, Bishop Curry's royal wedding sermon was wholly un-British, amazing, and necessary. And then the subtitle is, The Royals Could Not Handle It. And he goes through this really long, sort of remarkable summary of the sermon, including pictures of terrified-looking British royals listening to the sermon, and the end of it is amazingly lovely. He says, royal displays of emotion, such as Bishop Curry's, and if you did not watch it, it was a stem winder that could have come out of a Black Baptist church in Atlanta as much as Bishop Curry. Royal displays of emotion, such as Bishop Curry's, are profoundly un-British, but we as Americans are free to eat them the hell up. At this point in history, when the world seems to be getting crueler by the minute, an impassioned plea for self-sacrifice, a call for a life centered on the love of one's neighbor, is exactly what we need to be hearing. And then he went on with a couple jokes about Windsor Castle, and you finally get to the end of the article, and remember, this is a secular reporter in Esquire magazine. We really did not expect to get inspired by a royal wedding, but there you are. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go and join the Episcopal Church. So this morning, I'm grateful for coffee and Esquire, and I'm glad to be with you. And hey, for anyone who happens to be an Episcopal priest or layperson who is preaching tomorrow, no pressure. None at all. I just have up here my welcome slide to let you know that you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook, all those kinds of social media things. I have a website, and I'm sending around this, which is a sign-up list before, if you want to receive my newsletter. Just to let you know, I do have more than one shirt. I couldn't believe that I had my picture taken in this, because this is actually my favorite teaching shirt. Now I show up in it and people say, did we pay you enough? And so I'm going to pass this around and just make sure people at the table get it, pass it on to the next table, and if whoever is the last person with the purple clipboard, just make sure it gets back to me. And today we are going to talk about a wonderful and amazing subject, and that is gratitude. These are the covers of my last two books, Grounded, which was published in October of 2015, and now Grateful, which is 6 weeks old. I did not start out with a project to write a bunch of books that started with GR. There's sort of a joke now in the publishing house, oh, what's Diana's next book going to be? Grovel, a book on prayer, greed, a book on materialism. And so I have no idea. Grace, I heard a couple people say that. That has definitely been suggested and is under consideration, because it kind of goes with the theme, too. But anyway, these two books are related to one another, and I'm going to talk about that relationship, but they weren't planned. Grateful grew out of Grounded, and I just want to spend a moment telling you how that happened before I get started on gratitude and Grateful in particular. Grounded was a book that looked at a very simple question. The question was, where do people find God now? And when we think about God, what is the language we use for God, and what is the experience of God that is compelling and relevant and connected to people's lives today? I think that Bishop Curry's sermon today actually touched on it, that he came out and he said it very strongly. Love of God, love of neighbor. It was a very intimate kind of sermon. Powerful, but it was about God is love and God is fire, and God is with us right here and in that particular church and in the love of a young couple. And that's what Grounded is really about, finding God here with us. And in that book, I look at, first of all, in the beginning part of the book, about how we find God in the natural world. And this just happens to be a photograph that a friend of my daughter's took during the recent eclipse, on a cell phone. Don't we live in a remarkable time? I mean, it's just an amazing sort of place we live. And so we find God in the water, the ground, the soil, the air, all around us. Last night when I was at Jeff Lee's house, they were glowing about their garden. And I have a garden too. Actually, it's one of the things that Jeff and I have talked about over the years and has made us friends, this sort of deep interest we have in the earth as really the body of God, and the care of the earth and environmental issues and justice for the planet. And so the first half of the book is about that. The second half of Grounded is about how we discover God with and through our neighbors. And so it's about God in the natural world and God in the world of our neighbors. The book itself, the theological thread, is that we as culture, as Western culture, are moving away from these kinds of images of God. This is actually a 500-year-old painting, or a slide of a 500-year-old painting, not the painting itself. This was painted in 1515. It's an Italian artist whose name I can never remember. But if you Google big Italian God painting 1515, this is what comes up. And it's a fascinating thing to think that this is the primary image of God that was operative at the time of the Protestant Reformation. So this happened to be painted by a Catholic. But if you know anything about the theology that Luther and Calvin were writing, and certainly out of which the Book of Common Prayer grew in England, it's this kind of vision of God that was the common understanding that Europeans shared about what God looked like and who God was and where God lived. It's a fascinating painting. I have done this painting with groups of students before and analyzed it. What does this say about how we think about God? And it's a painting about God that is racialized. God is white. It's a painting where God has a gender, him. It's a painting where God is very different than us, set apart from us by a halo, separated from us. I'm looking out there. Don't see any halos yet. Maybe a few auras. But so God is different than us, and of course God lives in heaven. And this vision of God is one that if you have people and young adults in your life, you will know that this is not a vision of God that is terribly compelling or necessarily operative among younger generations of people who even consider themselves Christians. This is a vision of God that is going away. It might not even be your vision of God, but I do refer to this picture as the God who haunts Western imagination. So this is a God that still hangs around, and if you have friends who are atheists, if you ask them to describe the God they've rejected, they always describe this painting right here. And then I always say to them, well, you know what? I don't believe in that God either. And they look and they say, oh, you're a Christian. And I say, yeah. And they say, well, isn't that the God of the Bible? And I say, well, it's an interpretation of God in the Bible that Western Europeans held 500 years ago, which is kind of an interesting thing. And then grounded, what I do is I try to unpack some different images of God, and I come to think about how might we understand God now. And this is one of the ways that emerges, not only in Grounded, but in work that I've done for a long time, is that God is here, not in some clouds far away up there, but that God is here with us. And this painting, which I can't guarantee will last 500 years, but it's interesting, it is also done by a Catholic. This was painted by a Roman Catholic sister who lives in Minnesota. Her name is Sister, and of course, this is the name of a Minnesota Catholic nun, Sister Angsgar Holmsberg. Very Scandinavian sister name. And so Sister Angsgar Holmsberg has all these wonderful, beautiful contemporary images of God and Scripture. And what's fascinating about them is that they are all these kinds of images of the table, images of connection, images of God here with us. And what we have in this painting is not the distant God up there who is not much like us, but instead what we have here is God as the sun from the center of the picture, radiating through all of creation, humanity dancing around the circle with all these amazing different cultures represented by these people. And then you have the whole wrapped again in God around the edges of the circle. And so that is an image really of a profound sense of God here, now, with us. And so that was Grounded. When I wrote Grounded, I walk around my own world and try to connect with how God is present here in this circle, the circle of the earth. And I tell a lot of stories about that. One of the stories early in the book is this. I actually took this picture on the very day that I write about in Grounded. And this is the beach, East Beach in Santa Barbara, California. I was visiting California. It was very early in the morning because I was still on East Coast time. I woke up at 5:30 and I thought, ooh, I can go for a walk on the beach at dawn. So I pulled on my clothes, walked across the street that's right there, out into the beach. And this was the color that was present that morning. It's an amazingly beautiful morning with these kinds of soft colors, almost like a sepia tone, old antique photograph. Very little pink, very little blue, but all these interesting kinds of neutral tones. And as I walked right along the edge of the beach, I began to have this powerful sense of the Spirit's presence, of God's presence. And the water, the earth, and the sky, all of a sudden it was like I was inside of them. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that. But what happened was I literally fell down on my knees right there at the water's edge, and I said, thank you. And I wrote that story. And the reason I wrote it in Grounded is because I wanted to point out where I was going to be taking my friends and readers to talk about water, earth, and sky. And what I didn't notice when I wrote that moment up is that gratitude, thank you, was the natural response that I experienced from being in that scene. The gratitude piece was completely unintentional, unpurposeful, and when I wrote it, I didn't even notice it. It was not something I put there to point to anything. I was just explaining what happened to me. And so that is eventually where grateful comes from, is that I wrote a book called Grounded, about God here with us, about what it means to have a life that is deeply grounded, rooted here in this beautiful, amazing life, this beautiful, amazing planet that we have, one that is full of love of God and neighbor. And the natural response to that is being grateful. And so Grounded literally led to writing about gratitude. This was a little problematic for me because I have never stopped to consider gratitude in any really substantial way. And so I had to think about this. Why would I even want to write a book about gratitude? What is there to learn here? Well, this is one thing that I definitely learned, that gratitude emerges from the grounded life, as in that picture right there. You can't really see this definition from the back of the room, but that's okay. And I said theologically, that is for people of faith who care about the ancient traditions of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. Theologically, it emerges from an abiding sense of and trust in God's presence, that is, God is with us, the gifts of our lives, and the great abundance that surrounds us. And isn't that nice? But what is it? It's always nice to have a theological definition that you can say, oh yeah, that's really nice, and then it means very little. So really, what is it? The reason why this was a hard project for me to work on is because this is my idea of gratitude as a child. My first memories of gratitude were being told to write thank you notes to my grandparents or someone else who had given me a gift. We're in a very nice suburb in Chicago with a lot of well-mannered people, and so maybe you never had a struggle with this, but I tell you, this was very hard for me. And my mom would bring me pieces of paper to write thank you notes, and I would sit there and go, well, I already said thank you. Why do I have to write a note? Didn't make any sense to me, you know. And she said, well, it's what you do. And I would say, okay. And I'd sit there and I would say, dear Mimi. That was it. It was my first ever experience of writer's block. And so I would try to say, okay, thank you. And then my mother would come along and she'd say more. And I would say, well, what do you mean say more? I already said thank you. Isn't that like enough? And so my mom and I would have these long fights about thank you notes. And finally, she got so frustrated with me. By the time I was 14 years old, I went downstairs on Christmas morning. There's all the nice Christmas gifts under the tree. There's a book. Oh, I loved getting hardback books for Christmas when I was a kid, and even through high school. And so I pull this book out from underneath the tree. You can always tell it's a book. Rip the paper off of it. It was Miss Manners. And my mom had put a bookmark right in the section about thank you notes. A few weeks ago, I said to somebody, it was the most passive aggressive present I'd ever gotten. And someone from the congregation said, "There's nothing passive about that. It's just aggressive." So that was me and my mom, and thank you notes. And as I say in the book, the first thing that happened, out of this experience is I kind of gave up. I didn't really want to go there anymore because I felt like it was a place of failure for me, and it was a place of kind of obligation that I wasn't very emotionally attached to, and I really truly didn't know what to do with it. So when you think about this story, you think about Grateful, it was already mentioned that it's my 10th book. This is the first book that I've ever written where I didn't know anything about the subject before I started writing it, except for all my baggage. Every other book I've ever written, I have a PhD in religious studies, church history, all those other books were written from a place of expertise and knowledge. But this book emerged out of my experience from writing Grounded and just sort of accidentally falling into thankfulness, and then realizing I was being called to explore this thing that had always been somewhat of a mystery to me. When most of us, I think, hear the word grateful or hear the words thank you or think about gratitude, we think of something like this. We think about a feeling. We might remember the thank you note quarrel. Maybe you were really good at it, not so much for me. But certainly most of us think about a feeling. And gratitude is indeed that. It's a feeling in response to a gift. It's a very simple kind of definition. Gratitude always means there's a gift operative. And so the gift could be from someone, like your grandmother. It can be from God, if you happen to be a theist. It can be from nature. That whole episode of me walking on the beach, I'm a Christian, and so when I fell down on the beach, I was thanking God. A friend of mine who interviewed me for an atheist podcast said that he loved the entire description of that chapter. He said, "But why'd you have to go and spoil it and say God?" He said, "Why didn't you just say thank you?" And I said, "Well, that's really interesting because what I was thanking was a gift. And what you would be thanking would be for a gift too. We just happen to think that the gifts come from two different places. I frame gifts from God. You frame gifts from the natural world. But both of us are responding to the same thing, that the world and the beauty of the world is somehow a gift. And so there are feelings in response to a gift, which is an extraordinary kind of thing. As I was beginning to understand that my work had led me towards writing about gratitude, in November of 2008, this came across my desk. Those of you who have seen me before will go, "Oh my gosh, I'm so relieved. Diana's talking about data," because I love data and it's very meaningful to me. I have strong feelings about data. And so anyway, this data came across my desk. It's a small poll, released, of course, November 2015, right before Thanksgiving. And so Pew Research Center, who put together this poll, they were trying to get a story in the Washington Post, which they did. That's where I first saw this chart, was in a story in the Washington Post right before Thanksgiving. And the question that was asked of us in this poll was, have you, in the last week, felt a strong sense of gratitude? And notice that language, felt a strong sense of gratitude. And there was the answer. 78% of Americans feel strongly grateful on a weekly basis. Wow. I looked at that number and I went, that is really high. Any of you who are involved in polling and might be university professors or do this kind of data collection for your work will know that it is very rare to get over 65% agreement on pretty much any question. And so when you're up in the range of 80%, 8 out of 10 people saying the same thing, that's a very unusual number. I thought to myself, gosh, that's high. And then I thought, I think I'm one of the 22%. And I began ruminating on this. I thought, well, I knew just enough about gratitude, and I'd already been thinking about it for a few weeks because I was considering, this project. And so I knew just enough about gratitude from watching Oprah and things like that, that gratitude is good for us. And so you see a lot of stories like this in the media about gratitude. This is from the Washington Post just this year, February 19th. Can gratitude help you recover from a heart attack? And as you read the whole story, the answer is a resounding yes. I showed this slide in a presentation in an Episcopal church in Tucson, and after my talk and people were responding to it, a fellow got up. He was about 75, and he said, I just got back from my cardiologist today. And my cardiologist told me 3 things. Lose weight, exercise more, keep a gratitude journal. And it was directly related to a story like this. And so, yes, gratitude helps you with major illnesses of all sorts, not just heart attacks. You have better chances of recovery and better health outcomes if you practice gratitude. And then there's things like this. This is actually one of the most interesting quotes that I ran across, and it's just a summary of a whole body of research in neuroscience. A fellow by the name of Dan Baker, who is a neuroscientist, What Happy People Know. The book was written in 2003. And this little complicated quote is actually a very simple idea. And it says, during active appreciation, that is, if you are practicing gratitude, the threatening messages from your amygdala and the anxious instinct of your brainstem are cut off. Now, what does that all mean? Well, this part of your brain back here is the more primal part of our brain. It's the oldest part of the human brain. And it's back in that part of our brain that our less complex emotions reside. Things like fear. Saber-toothed tiger, run away. That's what's back here. Emotions like that. The front part of your brain, okay, so it says the anxious instincts of your brainstem, the primitive part of your brain, are cut off surely and suddenly from access to your brain's neocortex. This part of the brain, the neocortex, is the more evolved part of our brains. And neuroscience, from doing all their different kinds of amazing research that they can do now, has seen that things like compassion and empathy and gratitude, more complex emotions, are activated up here in the neocortex. So what we have going on inside our heads a lot of times is sort of a fight between the more sophisticated, newer parts of our brains that hold these more complex emotions and our primal parts of our brains, which hold very deep and very important primal emotions. If you're a person who you see a saber-toothed tiger coming at you, it's a good idea to run. That's how the human race survived for so long. So it's not good versus bad. They just are different parts of the brain, operative all the time, and they are in conversation. Those primal parts of our brain are so powerful, they can move very quickly from here to there. And then they take over the whole front part of our neocortex. And you hear people like this, you hear people talk about this kind of thing all the time. He didn't think before he shot. And that's what is happening here. Is that somebody, a police officer or whoever it is, sees something, oh my gosh, that guy's going to kill me. And so he pulls out a gun and he just shoots. Doesn't stop to think, oh look, it's a cell phone. because this moves here so quickly that it blinds all of the higher thinking capacities of the neocortex. If indeed you have developed this part of your brain, the neocortex, it slows down that process. It slows down the transmission of the fear and anxiety and dread as it moves forward. And all of a sudden, you can stop and you can evaluate what's going on, and you can make a different kind of decision. And so what neuroscientists have discovered is that when your front part, your neocortex, is developed through things like active appreciation, practicing gratitude, it actually gives you the capacity to act more humanly in emergency situations and make better decisions. It cuts off the primal transmission and allows you to be a different kind of person. And so they go on. He says it's a fact of neurology that the brain cannot be in the state of appreciation and a state of fear at the same time. These two states may alternate, but they are mutually exclusive. About half of the church fights that I have encountered in my long life working with churches can be explained by this slide right here. And pretty much I'd say about 90% of our politics right now in the United States can be explained by this slide. If you think about it, fear is on full throttle. Very few people are taking the time to let those neocortexes that are the most involved and amazing parts of our brains really do the work that they need to do, and to unhinge fear and to be able to enter into new space. The two states may alternate but are mutually exclusive. Wow, that is an incredible slide. I keep going back to that slide. It's just amazing. Dr. Robert Emmons from the University of California at Davis, who I believe is actually an Episcopalian, he is one of the world's greatest gratefulness experts. He teaches in positive psychology, which I said I had to learn a lot for this book. I had no idea that there's an entire field called positive psychology. I had never, ever read psychological research papers and medical research papers in my life. For writing this book, I had to sit down with people who were trained in these fields and have them teach me how to read research in these fields, and it was absolutely fascinating to me. I thought, I want to go back to college, and I'm going to major in this stuff. But anyway, so Robert Emmons, and he was lovely. He answered every single question that I had along the way. This is a slide from him, and he talks about this all the time with corporations and organizations. What good is gratitude? And these are his 4 big points. Gratitude allows celebration of the present. Wow. Instead of living in the fear of the future or a nostalgia about the past, gratitude, that highly developed frontal neocortex, that allows us to live in the here and now, to really embrace where we are. 2, gratitude blocks toxic emotions, not just fear, but envy, resentment, regret, and depression. 3, grateful people are more stress resilient. When things come at us, we can kind of stand there and go, okay, I'm not going to go instantly into this place, but I'm going to evaluate and try to apply different responses to this moment. And then finally, this one is I think, one of the sort of my good news moments for congregations. Gratitude strengthens social ties and self-worth. In other words, gratitude is one of the actual threads of community. Without gratitude, community can fray. With gratitude, community is actually one of the natural results. So this is a pretty fantastic vision of the social benefits of gratitude. Now, that's pretty cool. A large majority of Americans, 78%, feel a strong sense of gratitude or thankfulness on a weekly basis. And it's clear that gratitude has all these amazing benefits. Gratitude is good for us. Only 6% of Americans say they seldom or never experience gratitude. And so that means that Americans must be the most present oriented, positive, emotional people with no stress and strong community in the entire world. I looked at all of this and I thought to myself, okay, I really don't get it now. Because even in November of 2015, sitting in my office in Alexandria, Virginia, I could see that there was some sort of problem here, and that if 8 out of 10 of us said we were grateful, something was missing. 3 days after I got the 78% survey, this survey came across my desk. Look at same exact week in November 2016 or 15. This group, Public Religion Research, was trying to determine the emotional complexity of the American electorate going into the 2016 election. And what they had discovered was that a large majority of Americans say that life has changed for the worse. And they found out that Americans were more fearful and anxious, more nostalgic and hopeless, that is, thinking about the past and not having any hope for the future, and mistrustful and divided than had ever registered in any kind of survey like this. And so, on one hand, we're very grateful. On the other hand, we hate each other. It makes absolute no sense. This became what I call what I called in the book the gratitude gap. And what I dive into is the idea that somehow we have privatized gratitude, that we have made it a sort of a deeply personal feeling, something that we might feel with our closest friends and family, maybe in our the private sort of corners of our own spiritual lives. We may have deep senses of appreciation, but we have not really allowed gratitude to spill over into our communal and social lives in a way that would make an impact deeply and profoundly in our communities and our larger political life. And so my book about gratitude became rather different than a lot of the other gratitude books that I read, because almost every book written about gratitude emphasizes the private practice of gratitude, helping you feel more grateful and helping you develop practices so that you would have a more robust sort of private sense of appreciation for the gifts of your life, and therefore have good results in terms of your own health, your own well-being, your own stress. But I had only seen in the work that I did going into my book, there was only one other book that talked about the larger social and political consequences of gratitude. It was a book written by a Catholic nun in Canada, a woman by the name of Mary Jo Letty, who works with differently abled communities. She lives in a house with them in Toronto. And her book called Radical Gratitude is a real exploration of gratitude as a social practice and how it changes our relationships on large scale. And so this became a really interesting set of questions for me. If indeed we have privatized gratitude and just sort of made it this deeply individual experience, isolating it from our social lives, was there a way to both celebrate the good of gratitude on that personal level, but also to begin a journey as people toward what I call in the book a politics of gratitude? And would that be a pathway that could join us together in an entirely different way in a very difficult time in American history? And so there were a lot of really interesting questions that emerged for me for writing this book at the time I was working on it. It was very hard to write a book on gratitude in 2016. this uh, I as- I began to think that part of the problem was is that this idea of gratitude is a feeling. Because as soon as we put gratitude in the realm of feeling, it's very amorphous. It's sort of like when people talk about spirituality, folks always think that it's vague. It doesn't really have shape. How do you do it? And I realized that gratitude is a lot like that. And so I literally one day thought, I wonder if gratitude has a structure. And I wonder if anybody's written about that. And lo and behold, every liberal's favorite conservative columnist, um, David Brooks from the New York Times. Yes, indeed, he has an article in the only one. If you Google structure of gratitude, this is what comes up first. And it was from July of 2015. So I was kind of fascinated that he was seeing in the second half of 2015 the same sort of problem that I was beginning to view as well. And that is something had gone wrong in our public life. And in this short little piece, it's only like 600 or so words, New York Times short column. But he nevertheless speculated that part of the sickness in the American soul was our inability to understand the deep structure of gratitude as ethical system. And so I felt completely affirmed. It's always very affirming when someone who is different than you ideologically comes to the same kinds of conclusions you come to, because then you know you're not just seeing what you want to see, but you actually might be seeing something that's visible to people from a lot of different angles. And so David Brooks affirmed me. I was off to the races, and I began to think about the structure of gratitude. And so this is the part that I want to share with you until we can move into questions. This is I think it's about 10 slides. I'm going to take you through this structure piece and then have a conversation. The first piece of the structure of gratitude, and this is one of the things I just love doing in my own work, is that if I wasn't a historian, I might have become an architect, because I love the idea of framing things up in ways that are strong and sustaining and provide a kind of a sense of orderliness about understanding the universe, create environments of understanding. And so I start putting pieces of architecture, spiritual architecture, in place. The first piece was this, which I've already pointed to, is that there is a me of gratitude. Because in this practice, there is no way that I want to demean or diminish or take away from the power of it as an individual thing. Every one of us here has been given gifts, and that those gifts bring forth some element of gratitude in us in a variety of ways. And we need to attend to those things in our personal lives. But gratitude also has the we. And Robert Eamon said it on that earlier slide, is that gratitude strengthens social ties. And I implied it really since the beginning of this talk and opening my mouth. And that is, gratitude is our response to a gift. And what happens with gratitude is there's always two things involved: the gifter and the person who's receiving the gift. And so gratitude, in its very nature, is communal. And it could be communal between you and a friend who gives you a gift. It could be communal between you and God. It can be communal between you and just the beautiful natural order of the universe. But those are all communities, because generally, I don't go over to Nordstrom's, buy myself a new dress, and say, "Here, Diana, here's a gift for you," and then turn around and say, "Thank you, me." There has to be someone else or something else in the picture. There's a community of gifts in order for gratitude to exist. And so there's always a we. And in this particular book, one of the joys of writing this was thinking about the expansiveness of the we of gifts. And so that's the first thing, me and we. The second piece of architecture I put in place was this one, is that gratitude is actually two things, at the very least. And that is, it's a feeling, and it's also an action. And that's where my mom and I got in such a mess when I was a little girl, because I felt grateful that I had gotten gifts. As a matter of fact, I was and I still am, if something happens, I cry. I cried this morning at the royal wedding. Just I'm watching it on television, and there were several moments that made me really teary. But the most amazing one was, the thing that really brought tears to my eyes. It was a moment of gratitude, which is very intriguing. Is that after the wedding was over, Harry and Meghan walked out and down the stairs, and they looked beautiful and young and in love and happy and all those sorts of things. And right behind them came Prince Philip, who was standing between Prince Charles, who was standing between two women, his wife, Camilla, and Doria Ragland, who is Meghan Markle's mother. And I looked, and what was fascinating was I didn't really see that distance piece, where the royal personage is supposed to walk and then the women are always a little bit behind. I mean, they may have been a step behind, but not very much. It was really the three of them walking out of church behind the young couple. And Prince Charles just turned and talked to this amazing woman, black woman from Los Angeles, whose ancestors were held in slavery in South Carolina. And they were just chatting, smiling, incredibly comfortable with one another, clearly sharing the joy over their children getting married. And it was like, for a moment, the whole hideous history of slavery and oppression and colonization just disappeared. When you see the guy who was the descendant from the enslavers, the people who gave us this awful story that we've had to deal with for all these centuries, and the person who was on the short end of that story, whose ancestors had been the people held in slavery, walking down a church aisle, creating a new future together. And I started to cry. And I was so grateful. It was like, oh my gosh, the unexpected moment of reconciliation, a gift. A gift given to all of us all around the world who had the eyes to see. Very powerful emotion. Then, that's the way I am. I cry over stuff like that. And when I was little and got a gift from my grandparents, I felt it. If my grandparents gave me a gift, it was like the best thing ever. And I would just be so happy, and I would appreciate them so deeply. I loved them dearly, all these things. My mother, on the other hand, it's not that my mother was not a feeling-oriented person. She really was. But my mother always emphasized the actions of thankfulness, is that she didn't feel like the emotions were complete until you did something about them. And so she saw writing thank you notes, giving gifts of thanks, active sorts of acts of appreciation towards people who have done something nice to you. She saw that as the primary definition of thankfulness and gratitude. And so my mom and I were sort of operating out of these two different spheres. And when my mom would try to get me to write thank you notes, what she didn't know she was dealing with was a future writer. Because the reason I couldn't write the notes is that I couldn't, at 8 years old, form words that matched my feelings. It was a terrible dilemma for a future writer to be in, is not to have the words to be able to communicate what you were feeling. And so I had the feelings, but no words. My mom had words galore. She was really good at it. She was amazing at it. She was always the first person to say thank you to everybody. But sometimes my mom I always thought she went a little bit overboard with her obligations and sometimes didn't feel it quite so deeply because once in a while I saw her lying about thankfulness. Uh, is that she would tell somebody thank you, and really what she had just said to her family was, oh my gosh, I cannot stand that casserole, you know? And meanwhile, she was turning around to the ladies at the church supper saying, oh, thank you for bringing this, And so I thought there was a slight bit of inauthenticity there, and I noticed it when I was a kid. But gratitude is both of these things. It's we and me. It's our emotions and our actions. And here are some pictures of this internal complexity. And I hope you can relate to these. Imagine these on your phone. These are just 8 pictures of gratitude. Nearly everyone I know right now, as a parent, a grandparent, or if you're a person in your 20s or 30s, has this picture on your phone. I have several of them. They're all of my daughter, who is standing in various poses of gratitude on mountaintops, at beaches, riversides, etc. And this is the posture. If you Google gratitude image, this one comes up immediately. This idea of our hearts open to the whole of the universe, receiving and feeling the gifts. That's about an individual and her feelings. Here are some other ones of postures of gratitude from individuals. I love this picture up here. He's so happy, amazing smile, holding his hands over his heart. You know that's an image of thankfulness. And down here, this woman who, any of you who text a lot, especially if you have college-age kids, know that as soon as you put the word thanks in the text space, this is the emoji that shows up. And so here is a woman with a classic pose of thankfulness, and you can even see in her eyes there's a kind of wonder there, that's about feelings of gratitude. And then these are pictures of gratitude as well. My dreaded thank you note picture. It is really true. That is a picture of us as individuals and our actions related to gratitude. Writing thank you notes is an outward expression of an inward reality. And then things like this. Giving a token to someone who has done something for you. The apple to the teacher, the flowers to the host or hostess of a dinner party, simply I actually now like doing things like this, and I pay a lot more attention to it. I have these great, amazing neighbors who live across the street from me, and they're from San Francisco. And every single time I go through the San Francisco airport, I buy sourdough bread for them. And I just take it across the street because they're such good neighbors, and I want them to feel and taste a little bit of their home. And it reminds them that I appreciate them and that I'm glad for their presence on the street. Those kinds of things. Doing something as acts of appreciation to others. Now, those are pretty easy things to think about. And writing the notes, which I've learned to do a better job with, giving gifts. Now, this is also a picture of gratitude, which people here should instantly recognize. Because that, of course, is a picture of Chicago right after the Cubs won the World Series. I was in Cleveland a few weeks ago. They didn't laugh. But you probably have thought about this, having gone through this experience, or maybe not. Maybe you went through the experience and you didn't think about it as a gratitude experience. But this is a picture of we and our emotions of gratitude. People who have experienced relief, surprise, amazement, the breaking of a curse, seeing something that your grandparents only dreamt of and they died before they could see it. I mean, this is a remarkable moment. And what happens, of course, is everybody runs out into the street and there's total pandemonium and joy. And the source of it is being thankful. The Cubs won, and I was alive to see it. And then, of course, the I becomes the we. We were alive to see it. And this kind of amazing experience, it's really interesting that we don't pay as much attention to them in our culture as we should. But there are moments of this that happen not all the time, but frequently. They happen around sports events quite a bit. They do also happen sometimes around amazing kinds of arts or musical performances. They might happen on television. If a whole bunch of people are watching something and everybody's kind of transfixed at the same time. A few weeks ago, Jesus Christ Superstar was on at Easter, and it got huge ratings. And one of the things that was fascinating is watching Twitter and how people were responding to the songs. And there was this real communal sense of the joy around this story that is so familiar to people. And it was pretty remarkable. A few days later on Twitter, one of the things that I did not see, but I only saw it online, was all of a sudden, mostly people I know who are African American. I follow a lot of Black Twitter accounts, and that's a thing. It's actually called Black Twitter, for those of you who don't know that. So I follow all these Black Twitter accounts, and all of a sudden, all of them at one time were talking about Beyonce. And what it was is this huge performance that Beyonce did at Coachella, and it was stunning. And the whole thread that was coming out of all these African American women was their gratefulness about the sheer power and talent and giftedness of the queen. And so those kinds of things happen, and those are powerful. Festivities of all sorts, festivals, places where people gather with joy and gratitude and celebrate abundance. Sometimes they can be a little quieter than the streets. Sometimes these things are around our tables. When we gather joyfully with our families in scheduled feasts, but nevertheless, these are communal expressions of the we of our emotions of Thanksgiving. Hopefully you're not throwing those potatoes in your uncle's face. Now that is really powerful in the we and our emotions of Thanksgiving. Then these interesting set of questions began to occur to me. If we have me and my emotions, and then me and my actions around gratitude, and we have we and our emotions around gratitude, these two pictures, is there a we and our actions around gratitude? Is there some sort of sustained way of practicing gratitude together that is like writing the thank you note, like giving gifts of appreciation, like being publicly thankful in ritualized ways that deepen our senses of gratitude? And I think there are. I just started looking around on the internet, trying to see if there were ritualized ways in which groups of people were practicing actions of Thanksgiving. And I found a lot of these kinds of things. People standing with signs saying thank you, people who were clearly groups of people who had received some sort of gift and that were making a public expression of thanks. Now that can happen on the internet, and that I needed that because of a picture. But think of how many times that happens in life of, say, a church community. Usually during the announcements, perhaps, or recognition banquets, schools where people are being honored for their contributions for community, organizations like the Rotary, or those kinds of things, where these public moments where groups are thanked for gifts they have given or distributed to others. And then there is this public recognition moment. There's another expression of this in addition to just saying thank you in public, like writing a public thank you note. But there's this picture as well. And this is the idea that we have been given gifts, and so we turn around and give gifts to others. It's a little like the teacher and the apple. Is that the teacher has given you a gift, and you turn around and give the teacher or teachers. We used to do that at my daughter's school. We used to give all the teachers a gift. And this is a picture of young adults preparing a Thanksgiving meal. An organization called Everything But the Turkey. People always assume, as soon as they see this picture, it's a church supper or something, a church group feeding folks. But one of the things that I like pointing out is that this is actually something that happens that's just a very human response. These are young millennials, which means they probably don't go to church. No insult meant, just truth, demographic truth. And so they probably don't go to church, but this is a secular organization. And there are a lot of secular organizations like this, things like the United Way. It's about giving back or paying forward, recognizing that we as communities have been given gifts, and so we return gifts and share gifts with others. These little 8 pictures, think of now how there's these pictures sort of deepen the multi-dimensional understanding we have of gratitude. We've moved from just do you feel grateful to this vision of gratitude as personal and as communal, as about how we feel and about what we do. And that's the shape of the book. It actually becomes the shape of Grateful. There are 8 chapters in Grateful, and they are based around these 4 quadrants right here. There's 2 chapters on me and emotions. It begins by talking about the day that I received a thank you note for writing a thank you note. The thank you note for the thank you note came from an Episcopal bishop. I went, oh my gosh, I knew that Episcopalians love this kind of stuff, but this is a little over the top. I didn't know what to do. Do you write a thank you note in return? I was at a loss. And so me and my emotions, it's 2 chapters, and then I write 2 chapters about me and my ethics, meaning each one of us as individual, not just me as a person. But this top part of the graph that I have here, that is what most gratitude books are about. It's about how we feel grateful, and then how do we take those feelings and turn them into a more sustained way of life. And there are amazingly good gratitude books about that. Brene Brown writes about that. Robert Emmons, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce his last name, he's written about that. Most of the gratitude books that you can go on Barnes & Noble are written about this very thing. Usually those books are about some person who was not very grateful, who takes up a year practice of gratitude and how it changes their lives, how they move from just sort of emotional randomness with gratitude towards transformation. What I did in my exploration is that part is there, but then I add in this dimension as well. So in the same way, we feel grateful as communities, then we can move towards an ethic of gratitude together. And so that's the shape of the book in 8 chapters. And oddly enough, it looks like grounded. When I got around to the book, I realized I was really writing a story about a Thanksgiving table. And how we really can sit together, how we can really receive gifts and share gifts with one another, and how we're called to pass gifts around the table. And that is half of the book. And I love talking about this half because it's so beautiful. I'll just end with this little quick verse. For those of us who are Christians, this is just a really beautiful image because it conjures up immediately Eucharist. But it also should conjure up, ideas about family, ideas about America, ideas about community, a Thanksgiving table. For us, it also takes us into the New Testament. In the book, I talk about how when I was a teenager, I memorized this verse, 1 Thessalonians 5:18. I went to a Bible church, not an Episcopal church, when I was a teenager. That's why I was memorizing Bible verses. Um, so this is a classic, in all things give thanks. It's actually half of a verse from 1 Thessalonians. What I did not know when I memorized this verse is something that I think is absolutely amazingly joyous about Christianity. And we will start with questions in just a moment. And when I figured this out, it sort of came into my life as a Christian and turned me inside out. It made me so happy. Sometimes when we open up the New Testament, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so we think that Matthew is the first book of the New Testament. And so the New Testament opens with Jesus being born. Actually, that's not how it worked in history. The oldest book in the New Testament is 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians was probably written around the year 50, about a dozen years, maybe a little less, by Paul. This is authentically Paul. There is not a biblical scholar in the world who disputes that this letter was written by Paul. So it's authentically Paul, written somewhere between 8 and 10 years after his conversion. And so the very first words of Pauline theology, the very first words of Christian theology, the very first words of what will become the New Testament are from 1 Thessalonians. And the book of Thessalonians opens with, I give thanks for you. This entire book, little short book, is all about gratitude. The very first words of Christian theology are thank you. I give thanks for you. And when I saw that and then realized that this verse, of course, is embedded at the back of that same book, all things give thanks, I began to think to myself, what if that was the lens through which we read everything in Christian theology? I think that's what Paul wanted. It would revolutionize how we read the New Testament, how we would sing our hymns. It would revolutionize the kind of theology we write, I know that. And it would really turn, I think, our sort of liturgical vision towards depths that we have not even begun to plumb yet. And so, for Christians, gratitude is not an add-on. It is not just a self-help device that Oprah likes, for which I am very grateful. I think it's fabulous that this is a cultural language and a cultural conversation and something we can really talk to people who are atheists and agnostics and Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and everybody else. We can share a conversation in gratitude, but for us as Christians, it is the hinge, it is the theological hinge on which everything else depends. And that is just amazing, that Christian theology is not at an end in contemporary culture. As a matter of fact, it might just finally be coming into its own. And what a fantastic way of seeing our deepest message and embracing the vision of Paul, which is, of course, also the vision of Jesus. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Jesus in the second half. So until then, we got about 15 minutes or so to have a conversation. I really look forward to what you might be thinking in response to what I've shared here. Yes?
So what you just said, is that now why Thanksgiving is a bigger deal holiday than it maybe used to be?
What I actually think is Thanksgiving historically is a littler deal holiday than it used to be,
Right.
which is fascinating. Thanksgiving in the United States has just a very interesting history. It wasn't nationally celebrated until after the Civil War, which is another interesting thing about how Thanksgiving was related to Reconstruction, which is one of the reasons why those of you who are Southerners, who might be Southerners here, know that Southerners have always had very awkward feelings about Thanksgiving because it was related to Reconstruction and Abraham Lincoln and stuff. But it should be at the center of some of our talk about race and racial reconciliation and what it means to really set an American table. Because it was intended sort of politically to reset the American table after the Civil War, to include winners and losers, to include people who were black and white, to really think about what it meant to be together in Thanksgiving in a new way. And so Thanksgiving was much more popular at the turn of the 20th century and the beginning of the 20th century than it is now. Churches used to be full on Thanksgiving Day, which is interesting. That's kind of a law. Do you still do that here? Is it mostly full? Yeah, well, that's better than many because usually many churches don't even hold services on Thanksgiving any longer. Sometimes there'll be a kind of a Tuesday night service before everybody hauls out of town, and usually it will be with local synagogue, sometimes with the church, a synagogue, and a mosque all together celebrating it. But those services are fewer and further between than they have been. And of course, Thanksgiving has been commercialized. So that even if, nice people in a room like this have the whole day off, think about all those Latinos and black people and poor white folk in Chicago who have to work at Walmart and Target. And what is happening, of course, is that Thanksgiving is being squeezed by economic pressures so that people who are from poorer communities don't even really get a chance to celebrate because usually they have to work. And Thanksgiving has just become part of the big run-up to Christmas. I think that it's really time to reclaim Thanksgiving in some really powerful ways. I would love to see that happen. There is a World Day of Gratitude on September 21st. I'm kind of wondering if that might be animated in some ways that would be exciting as kind of a global celebration of gratitude. And Thanksgiving is only celebrated in a handful of countries around the world. We celebrate it, Canada celebrates it, Japan celebrates it. I think there are like 12 or 14 countries that have national Thanksgiving celebrations. We could use it globally. So, yeah. But I think that you're right there, Think about that as a powerful ritual, communal celebration, and being able to repackage it in some new ways and beat back the consumerism of Thanksgiving would be pretty fabulous. Yeah. Other comments, questions? Uh-huh.
Going back to your atheist commentator on your photo, I struggle with trying to figure out how you can be grateful if there's no donor. This person who commented said, if you left out God, it would have been a nice story.
Uh-huh.
But if you left out God, it was like a random act of molecules floating around in the natural world. What's the point? It's a random act. Then why be grateful?
Well, I think it's actually I am incredibly generous when it comes to other people's perspectives on these kinds of questions. And for my friend, what it is that random thing has occurred. And what a miracle it is. And that those random molecules could combine and create that moment, that is a gift. And there might not be a theistic donor involved, but there's something that is deep and beautiful and profound that a person who is not a theist recognizes as giftedness. I think that's gorgeous. So that's how other people do see it. And I don't have to share that view of the issue, but I certainly do share that it's a gift. And that's where we can come together. So there's no need for me to criticize his non theistic view of the gift. And there really is no reason for him to criticize my theistic view of the gift. But we can actually sit together at table and share a meal and appreciate the abundance and the gift and the beauty together, no matter where we have respectively assigned where it came from. So actually, I'm pretty much every atheist's favorite Christian guest on podcasts. I love being in conversation with atheists who want to talk about these things. There are mean atheists because there are mean Christians too. And so what I'm trying to figure out is how we can move together in concert, honoring the beauty of this world and honoring one another. And I think that's part of my calling, what I'm trying to do. Yes, I saw this woman's hand next.
Are you finding, or did you see in the course of your writing your book, or as you think about what you've seen in the past, any examples, vibrant examples of communities harnessing this power or this collective we and gratitude, and either intentionally or intuitively doing it really well, so that it's actually being fostered and I'm just kind of curious if you've seen what does this look like, and maybe in what kind of community setting that's happened.
Oh, that is a great question. You know, right now my antenna are up for looking for communities like that. And I do think that you find them around spiritual communities and religious communities quite a bit. It's certainly the intention of the prayer book revisions of the 1970s in the Episcopal Church was to put Eucharist, Thanksgiving table, in the center of the liturgical life of our church, and to really move that into this place of consciousness, and then seeing what kind of church would flow from that. So I think that we were pretty intentional about that. Other sorts of denominations have been in Christian frameworks. I see a lot of communities of gratitude, certainly around I would say kind of issue-oriented things. There are communities that emphasize, like this Mary Jo Letty community in Toronto, caring for people who are differently abled together, and part of their base is the celebration of life, and that to really celebrate the gift of life no matter what form it takes. And I know that group, like L'Arche for Nowen, was very much that kind of community. So there are examples of it. And there are traditions that are better at it than some other traditions. Every time I have talked about this topic in rooms where there was a lot of racial diversity, one of the first things out of the gate usually is an African American minister reminding me that the beloved community is actually constituted around gratitude. When African American people were held in slavery, and I'll talk a little bit about this more in the second half, but when they were held in slavery, the question is, and then how do you feel thankful? And what developed in African American communities was an ability to claim the deepest kinds of abundance of life, and the deepest kind of appreciation for simply being alive, the gift of life. And that becomes really one of the fountainheads of African American theology. And so whereas in one of those earlier slides that I showed about fear, mistrust, anxiety, and all those bad negative emotions, the reason they were so high is because white people feel those negative emotions so highly. When I went into the survey, black people and Hispanic people actually did not feel those negative emotions. Yeah, they were the inverse. And it's just because those communities are smaller that they don't lift the numbers as much nationally. So it's interesting because if you've ever worshiped in communities like that or done work in those kinds of communities around different sorts of political and social issues, oftentimes the language of Thanksgiving, the songs of Thanksgiving, the complete abandonment to gratitude is part of the political and social motivation in those communities. Really beautiful stuff. Hmm. Yes, back here and then a couple more.
Is there any data that speaks to a correlation between wealth and gratitude?
Yes, people who are wealthy are less grateful.
And what is the break point where what is?
I have to go back and I'd have to look at that. But it does seem that communities that are privileged will tend to feel like they are entitled to more rather than being grateful for what they have. And that people who have less tend to have higher ability to celebrate gratitude. What that does for a lot of white people is leads us to romanticize poverty, which is not the point. Um, but what it really does point out to us is that a certain amount of cultural comfort through wealth blinds us to giftedness. And I would have to look for the break point, but I believe that there is data that shows what it is. It's fascinating.
It seems very related to what you were talking about within the Black community and developing this culture, even in slavery, of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
How do we understand that in this culture as well?
Yeah, there are deep economics that are related to this. That's a little bit where I'm going to move in the second half. I think that it's lunchtime, and we'll have a good time for conversation. And after lunch, Jesus and money and some other really non-provocative things.
Before we do break for lunch, just to let everybody know, the food itself is in the parish library.